In today's episode of Writer Chats, we travel to America to meet legal affairs reporter and celebrated novelist Andrew Welsh Huggins.
Okay, so this is Amit. Amit,
Hi, Andrew. Hi, nice to see you, Andrew. Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
I know that you're a reporter for the Columbus, Ohio Press, yeah?
The Associated Press, yeah.
Associated Press, yeah. But what does that mean? What's the difference?
The Associated Press is we're a wire service, international wire service. So we provide news, video, photos, text stories to customers around the United States, but also across the world. We actually have quite a big bureau in London and then internationally everywhere. So I'm essentially a wire service reporter. We don't have a print product, but my stories go into newspapers and on websites all over the place.
Oh, and how long have you been doing that?
I've been with the AP for 22 years, and I've been a reporter for about 32 years.
Yeah. Okay, so what you do, you're reporting. You wrote like 2 books. So I think the first book was called No Winners Here Tonight.
That's right.
You had two non-fiction books, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've written 4 fiction books, yeah.
So it's actually 7. The 7th one comes out soon, and then I also have a short story anthology that I edited.
So you from Columbus?
No, I'm from New York State, the western part of New York State. So nothing exotic like New York City. Where I grew up, it was very rural, dairy farms everywhere. Yeah. But I went to college in Ohio to a small liberal arts college in central Ohio called Kenyon College, named for Lord Kenyon, actually, back in the 19th century. And that's a school known for writing, and there's no professional degrees of any kind there. So I actually was a classics major there, Greek and Latin. That was subjects I was always interested in. It was not it was not a degree I expected to make much money in, but it just interested me.
Yeah, that's the thing, to do something for love. So have you traveled to Greece?
Yeah, I was there. I was in Greece during college, and then right after college, in the early 80s, I had a fellowship, and I traveled to different countries in Europe where I studied, I guess they call them minority languages. So I lived in Ireland for about 6 months, and at the time I was pretty fluent in Gaelic. I moved to Wales and learned some Welsh. I moved to Spain and learned some Catalan.
Yeah. And
that came in pretty handy because our oldest daughter actually married a guy from Catalonia. So now I'm relearning Catalan.
Yeah. So you know Gaelic. That's crazy. I only know one sentence in Gaelic, but it's a pub, it's a bar in Liverpool.
Okay.
It's called the Pog Mahone. I don't know if you know.
Mahone. That's the phrase everyone knows.
Yeah, everyone knows. That's the only one I know. So you studied in Greece as well, or just traveled around?
I was there. I traveled there, and we actually did an archaeological dig while we were there. We went out to a little island. I wasn't there very long, but
which island?
It was enough to get me interested in it.
Yeah. Was it Knossos or the island?
No, it was in the Gulf of Corinth. I don't actually remember the name. The island was an uninhabited island. It was very small.
So Amit, just to introduce yourself and
of course. Yeah, firstly I'd say Andrew, nice to meet you. I've been getting into some of your books when Tim mentioned that we'd be interviewing you and having a little writer's chat. So I picked up one of the Andy Hayes series, Slow Burn, which was right up my street because a bit of background. I'm an ex-criminal defense lawyer. Before I switched to now, I've been basically a middle school humanities teacher, encouraging youngsters to write and also developing my own writing. So I just reading the book, I kind of get the idea that something which I felt maybe I was a bit alone in the profession, that looking at, for example, this character, this young, this boy Aaron, that you do have a bit of understanding of how in the criminal justice system, whether we look at America or Britain, that we don't always go very deep. So for example, with Aaron, you really look at all these, these family issues and, things like divorce and, addictions and drugs. And I think that's why I ended up leaving, the profession myself, because I thought there wasn't enough delving into that. And I was just wondering, where did you get that? Obviously, you've kind of probably used some of your own experiences, but where did you get that kind of insight, and why were you curious rather than just, happy to condemn, and always see, the way normally people do, black and white, when it comes to people that have, committed crimes?
Yeah, so great question. So, slow burn involves a fatal fire at a college dorm, or an off-campus college house, and that's actually based on a real Columbus, Ohio case that happened back in 2003, and it actually to this day remains unsolved. Now, in that case, there were 5 students who were killed in this fire, and there was a young man who was arrested very briefly for that fire, and he was held for about 48 hours, and then he was released, and that's the last person that's ever been interviewed as part of it. So, I had covered that case as a reporter. I was always very interested in it. I was interested in the fact that this kid had been brought in for some reason. I think they had circumstantial evidence that he might have been by the house or something. But I guess I'm just always, in my own reading, I like stories and novels where, there's a twist. There's something that does go beyond that kind of black and white perception, as you put it. And I had a lot of that on my mind when I was writing that. I knew, I also sort of liked the idea of someone who, might have had a tangential connection to a case like this, and everything points to him being the guilty party. But then when you probe a little bit different, the whole thing unravels. And, all criminal justice systems are imperfect, and we see lots of open and shut cases in the United States where when you start probing a little bit more, it's not the person who did it. People are exonerated all the time. So, I think those were some of the things on my mind.
It seems a very American, even though we've had, a British obsession with these private detectives. I think most of us have grown up reading Sherlock Holmes and, maybe some of Agatha Christie's, Poirot and various other detectives. But it seems like in American culture, there is a very, it's a bigger arena when it comes to this field, this kind of unknown field of private detectives. And obviously your books do focus around someone who's not he's not a police detective, he's a private detective. So I had a question which came up when I was reading it. I think here it would only come up, you would maybe want to use one if you think your spouse is having an affair or something, but they're not very common. So I was wondering, is it a regulated kind of area, or does anyone who decides I want to investigate things just rock up and say, right, I'm going to become a private investigator and make some money from this business? So how does it work over there?
Well, it varies from state to state. You can, I guess you could call yourself an investigator, but it's not necessarily illegal, but you're running a risk because you're not vested somebody would be running a risk if they hired you. So, in the state of Ohio where I am, it's regulated by the State Department of Public Safety. And yeah, you apply for a license, you're vetted, background check, and then you receive a state sanctioned license. And in exchange, you have access to some databases that the ordinary person might not. You don't have any of the powers that a law enforcement officer would have, but you can tap into databases and get a little bit more information than the average person, for sure. So yeah, there's a whole world of fictional, off the books private detectives. How realistic those are, I don't really know. Lawrence Block, the American writer, has a whole his whole Matt Scudder series set in New York is all about a guy who's an unlicensed private eye. And, you know, those are fantastic books, but you kind of wonder how realistic that is in real life. I mean, in real life, there are private detectives that get hired all the time. Yeah, to chase down cheating spouses, but a lot of times they background people. You hire them to background your employees. You hire them to see if they're cheating on workers' comp fraud. Like they said they can't work because of a back injury, but you catch them, you know, hauling planters onto their porch. And then there's also just, you know, sometimes people do hire private detectives because they're frustrated that the police aren't getting as far as they think they should. There was a case in Columbus just a few years ago where a man's daughter had gone missing and he was very frustrated. The police couldn't turn her up, and he hired a private detective to try to find her. And you know, he realized he discovered she'd been killed. So I try to keep it somewhat realistic. I mean, there really are people like my character. They really are licensed. He probably gets into a little bit more exciting things than possibly real life, but you know, it is an actual thing.
Mm-hmm. You get lots online, you know, private detectives. I don't know if you saw, there was a case in America, you know, the Cecil Hotel in Los Angeles. It's
Okay.
like a famous hotel, yeah. It's right near Skid Row. And there was a girl who went missing, and she'd gone missing, and there was the last footage of it was in an elevator, and she was acting very strange.
Canadian girl.
Do you know this girl? Yeah. And there was a big thing online, and it was like people were invested in the case so much that it's like they wanted her to have been murdered. And it turns out she just decided to go swimming and went swimming in, you know, the water tank at the top of the hotel. And there was no real mystery, but this is the problem with like private detectives lots of the time, when they haven't got the access to that information. And like you said, so what information would that include? Is it like police databases and things, or?
Well, you can run, you know, like if I see a license tag, I mean, I can't run that to figure out who that belongs to, but a licensed private detective, at least in Ohio, that's something that they can do.
Yeah.
And then they can't access the state criminal justice system, but they can go deeper on, I don't know, background checks, criminal records, and they can just get a little bit more than the average person. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that, you know, private detectives are up against the internet, which is to say there's a lot of information out there now that anybody can get. And so some of the things that they used to charge you for, if you really want to do it, you can just do it yourself. So, I mean, that's a real issue that I've heard private detectives talk about, that they, you know, they have to figure out what it is they offer that the average person can't get. I should have said another thing that private detectives do all the time is, you know, they're hired by defense attorneys to research criminal cases. You know, a defense attorney, at least in the United States, will hire someone who's an investigator, and they'll say, I need you to go find these 3 witnesses and take statements from them. There was another case recently where somebody was trying to track down a white supremacist and see if they could just find his address so that he could be served with a civil lawsuit subpoena. And some of that sounds really exciting, and it can be, but again, a lot of that is just good old-fashioned legwork, that somebody who has good computer skills and is willing to get out and knock on some doors can do.
Yeah. And the
I
resources.
think the use of experts, definitely, you know, that's something which I was doing a lot, but yeah, it sounds like it's probably more, you know, as part of the incorporated the American kind of justice system to use more private investigators. But yeah. Just
to deviate a little bit, I saw like an amazing case that you were talking about. I think it was your second book. Yeah, it's called Hated in America, about Al Qaeda, 3 suspects. Can you just go through that? Just because I think that second book was the one that intrigued me the most, because like I've done another video about a guy who joined Islam, and his father actually went and got him back from Syria. So this little thing, and also recently I've watched the Unabomber case, and at the end of that, you say that he was in with Ted what's his name, Ted Kowalski or something? Kaczynski, sorry, yeah. And that little interview, I'll post it underneath this video afterwards. But could you just go through that story?
Sure. Yeah. So that book is called Hatred at Home, and it stems from this sort of very strange and at the time super unique case that started in after 9/11. There were three guys here in Columbus who became friends at a local mosque. One of them was a immigrant from Pakistan. He was a truck driver. One of them was from Somalia. We have a huge Somali population in Columbus, and one was just a regular old guy from Columbus who had converted to Islam. And they met at a mosque, got to know each other, and then in August of 2002, they had coffee together at a coffee shop, and this is right when the U.S. had invaded Afghanistan, searching for Al Qaeda, and they were very upset with a lot of the civilian casualties, and they made a lot of kind of sort of idle threats. Well, fast forward, the guy from Pakistan he'd actually gone to. He had been in the Al Qaeda training camp. He had met Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the architect of 9/11. He'd met bin Laden. He supposedly had driven to Brooklyn to, as the authorities said, to scope out the destruction of the Brooklyn Bridge. And that's eventually what he was prosecuted for. What was interesting about this case is it was one of the first of these domestic terror cases after 9/11 in the United States. These were pretty big deal at the time. And of course, here we were in Columbus, Ohio, and we had this guy who was a truck driver, and it was just huge news. And then the other thing that was interesting about it was that they charged each of them individually, and it took time. So they charged Ayman Ferris, the truck driver, and then they charged Nuruddin Abdi after that, and he was charged with threatening to shoot up a shopping mall, which was basically just this idle threat he'd thrown out at this conversation that they were having. And then the third guy, Christopher Paul, he actually had made some contact with terrorist cells in Hamburg, Germany, and in some ways he was probably the most radicalized of them all. The first guy, Ayman Ferris, was kind of a dreamer, a little bit crazy. Basically, I think he got in someplace a little bit too deep. He thought he was going to write a book about it, make $1 million. Nuruddin Abdi, I think, was just a guy who was upset, but he made some statements that he came to regret. Anyway, I found the whole case kind of fascinating because of all these reasons. I had these three guys from different backgrounds. It was here in Ohio. The way the feds prosecuted the three was different than a lot of the other cases. And there were just a lot of strands of what we were going through at the time that came together on that book.
So when you're writing something like that, yeah, when you're writing it into a book, do you have any problems like legal issues and things like this? Because you report, it's almost like reporting real facts, yeah, but just putting it into a coherent story into a book. Do you run into any legal issues the second question, how do you get all this information? Do you just from reports or firsthand? Did you speak to some of these individuals face to face, or
Yeah, all good questions. So legal issues, not really. I mean, everything I got a ton of information from court documents, and everything I had was declassified. So it wasn't like I had somehow gotten a hold of classified information. So it was a combination of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of court documents, interviews I did with law enforcement, and interviews I did with the ex-wife of the guy from Pakistan. She was a huge source. Relatives of the guy from here in Columbus, and some family members of the guy from Somalia. So it's kind of a combination of reporting I like to do. It combined, facts that were on the record through court documents, but then also talking to real people and trying to figure out exactly.
Did you meet any like resistance along the way? Any sort of like, people threatening you, or was it basically okay?
The family members of the guy who was here were not real interested in talking to me. I mean, this was a huge embarrassment, right? I mean, he was a real outlier. It's not like the rest of the family was like this. But I did find an older cousin of his who was willing to talk. And similarly, the family of the guy from Somalia, for one thing, I think his parents were not native English speakers, and it was difficult for them to communicate. Plus, again, that this was not what their family did. But I found one of his sisters who kind of wanted to set the record straight, and so that was good.
Mm-hmm.
And with the first guy, Ayman Ferris, his ex-wife was extremely open. She pretty much told us everything. She was very interested in.
Is it reliable?
I'm sorry?
Is it reliable if she's his ex-wife?
Yeah. Well, that's a good point, actually. I mean, whenever you do an interview like that for a nonfiction book, yeah, I mean, you get a piece of information and then you have to vet it. So I did do a lot of vetting, but I think she gave us the right picture, I think.
So the process of writing books like this, which are, fact-based, transitioning into fiction, from nonfiction to fiction, which one would you enjoy more? Which one do you think is like more pleasurable to write?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I do really like I like the fiction writing because it does sort of give you. I mean, I do a lot of research for my fiction, but a nonfiction. I'm working on a true crime book right now, and the amount of documentation, just like with my first two books, it's kind of overwhelming. The nice thing about fiction is you can, kind of make it up as you go, and to a degree, it's a little bit easier. But I've been a reporter for over 3 decades, so I like doing those kinds of things. And like I said, I'm sort of juggling a bunch of projects right now, a bunch of fiction projects, and then this one true crime project, which is nonfiction. So, I kind of like them both.
But like the fiction, do you use lots of like sort of real stories and just mix them in and change the names and things, or is it just hopefully?
I think it's more, a lot of my novels are inspired by real events, but I think I do more than change the name. So I wrote my 5th novel with my private eye is called The Third Brother, and that's based loosely. There's a couple of themes in there, but one of them is based on a real thing that happened in the United States. There was a shooter, a guy who shot up a military recruiting center in Tennessee. I'm going to get my dates wrong, but I think that was 2015, and 3 or 4 people were killed. And he was, I think he was a Muslim convert. I don't remember exactly, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Right after that, spontaneously, all across the United States, these good old boys with guns on their belts, because this is America, were showing up outside Navy and Army and military and Marine recruiting stations and literally sitting in folding chairs protecting the centers. And there was the military didn't want them there, but there was nothing they could do about it in a lot of cases. And that happened right here in Columbus. It happened 1.5 miles from my house. So I went up there and did a story on it and talked to these guys. And that inspired sort of a lot of what happens in The Fifth Brother, where essentially a young Somali boy is, he's accused of terrorism and then he disappears. And you don't know exactly what's happening, but there's a strong white supremacist angle going on. So I think, that's a good example. My book that's coming out in June is called An Empty Grave. And that's based a little bit on a story I covered here where 40 some years ago, there was a cop who was shot by a burglar, and the cop returned fire and wounded the burglar. But the burglar was never prosecuted, and he kind of sort of walked out of jail for some reason. And eventually he was found alive 40 years later, and there was an attempt to try to prosecute him, but it was too late. I covered a lot of that story, and I sort of wrote the most recent book a little bit inspired by that. Again, it veers kind of far from what really happened, but it gave me some good ideas.
There's so many things that have come up. Sorry, I was waiting for the right moment, but I was just going to ask Andrew. I remember in between finishing university and before starting law school, I wanted a little break, and I came to New York. And I was up on the Twin Towers, and then returned. And a couple of weeks later, I just started. I think it was my first week at law school, and I got the news, and I was still shocked, because I could see myself there, spending the day, still restaurants. But when I came back a few years later, I didn't come back till I was maybe in my late 20s again. I could definitely sense the difference, and I would like to say that definitely the way I look, I definitely felt like there was definitely this new kind of suspicion about people who looked a certain way. So when Tim obviously mentioned you doing that piece about homegrown terrorism, so my question really was, when you were looking at the backstory of these three individuals. And I should probably mention, interestingly enough, where I am in southeast London, we have a huge Somali community, and I've also visited a lot of them in young offenders institutions, and tried to understand a little bit about the journey of coming to England and ending up caught up in this kind of thing. But anyway, the question is, without obviously ever trying to justify or condone these things that people get involved in. Are you also more interested in, as with the kind of the Andy Hayes, with maybe the private investigator stories, are you more interested in the human side of what makes people, for example, if they live in the US, why would anyone ever want to cause, death and destruction? And is it like, are you maybe like me also a bit of a amateur psychologist, where you just really want to get deeper and deeper into the human psyche to understand what makes people do what they do? That's the question.
Yeah, really good question. So, let me start out by saying one of the things we noticed here is that it's the 1 in 99 that always gets the attention. So there was another case in Columbus a couple years before this whole business with the recruiting stations, where there's another young man who he had been radicalized, and he was arrested, and his family was just in shock, and they couldn't figure out what happened. And we tried to get to the bottom of that, because this, at least here, this is not a case of there's the Somali population in Columbus has got to be like one of probably the most law-abiding community there is, but there's this whole phenomenon of the YouTube radicalization, and these young people fall prey to it. And we've tried to look at that a lot. I mean, the most famous case in Columbus happened in time flies, 2017 maybe. There was an 18-year-old Somali man who was a student at Ohio State University, and I mean, one day he took his car, dropped his little sister off at school like he always did, drove to campus, drove the car into a crowd of people, and jumped out with a knife and started attacking people. And just, his family was absolutely floored. I mean, when the FBI came to their door, they might have said, "Your son just got on a rocket ship and went to Mars." They were so stunned; they had no idea. And the whole, and to this day, I mean, the family was just like, "We have no idea. We absolutely have no idea." And, so in covering that case and covering the other ones, yeah, that's what you try to get to, because the stereotype is, oh yeah, he hates America. But, the online radicalization is a real thing. And I think, unfortunately, I mean, we see this right now in the United States with all these people who breached the Capitol on January 6th. I mean, all of them, almost to a one, had just gone down this internet rabbit hole. And, their relatives are coming out and saying, we don't know what happened to him. He was fine until he started going on Facebook and seeing these QAnon posts. And that's not to excuse what they did, but it's a powerful force.
I'm always interested in, when I'm encouraging, the students to write, whether it's through free writing or, building characters and things. I'm always wondering how, people who've published books, like you've published, over 7-8 books, how you've taken an idea. So obviously, like with the Andy Hayes, detectives idea, how you've taken that idea and how you've actually put it, finally decided, right, this has been in my head so long, I don't care if this works or not, I don't care if it's professionally successful, I'm just going to put pen to paper. How do you test it out? I mean, do you have a trusted group of people?
Let me answer that question in two ways. First of all, I usually I don't really outline much. I usually have an idea in my head, and I'll think a lot about it in my head, and I'll try to figure out where it's going, and eventually one of those will come to the surface, and I'll say, okay, this is what I'm going to try to write this about. When in the midst of my fiction writing, I now have a number of people that I do bounce things off. Oftentimes these are usually former police officers who are willing to answer questions about procedure or weapons or various things like that. And I do have, they're called beta readers, people who are willing to give once you've polished it to the point where you feel good enough to finally show it to someone. I do have people who will read it and comment on it. And I mean, the very first one of those is my wife, Pam, who is always my first reader, and she always makes fantastic suggestions. But so, it's sort of a combination of, there are people I consult all the time while I'm writing, and then there are people that I show my drafts to once I'm done. But what I always tell people, especially, I mean, I don't interact with students quite at that age, but I just always tell people, part of it is just forward progress. It's just, don't get caught up in trying to figure out too much. If you have a fun idea in your head, just write it down and just write for a while. And I mean, honestly, a lot of times what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to get to the end of the draft of whatever it is, because for me, that's when the real work begins. That's when I feel like, wow, I have this thing that I've built, and now I can shape it. And I think almost all writers, if they're being honest, are going to tell you that's how they work, that there's a lot of rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. The one huge exception to this, if you know the thriller writer Lee Child, who has that Jack Reacher character, he's actually retired that series or he's turned it over to his brother, but he famously sort of writes, finishes it, and kind of turns it in. He says his first draft is his only draft, and I think that's a real exception to what most people go through, where you finish that first draft. To me, that's always a great feeling, because now I can kind of dig back and start making it work.
What would you consider doing this? Just doing one draft and that's it?
Or I don't know.
What would this expose about you as a writer?
I don't think it would come out. I don't think it would come out very good. I wrote a novella recently, which was about a 17,000 word story. And that's the closest I've ever come to writing something straight through where, when I was done, it felt pretty complete. I mean, I did go back and definitely do some editing and changes and things, but that's probably the one thing I've written recently where I was like, okay, yeah, that, like, start to finish, I feel like it just flowed. I probably wrote it in 2 weeks and just didn't make a whole lot of changes. But writing a whole book like that, I don't know. That would be beyond me right now. In my nonfiction books, I keep a timeline. So especially on the Hatred at Home, and I'm doing that now with my true crime book. And right now I have about a 60-page single-space timeline of everything that happened and documentation for everything that happened. And that's kind of how I write the nonfiction stuff, because in some ways it's like writing a novel. You don't want to give away everything. Even though you know how something ends in real life, a really good nonfiction book will just walk you through the steps as though you've never heard of this case. And following a timeline is really important to doing that. So in some ways, you can layer a nonfiction book the same way as you would a novel. You can drop clues in early. You can foreshadow. You can do all those things. The only difference is those are things that actually happen, and you just have to be careful where you put them. Because like I said, you don't want to say at the very, very beginning of a book about a criminal committing a crime or whatever. You don't want to say, and years later when he was in prison. No, you don't want to put that in there. You want to wait and let people find out that happened at the very end.
Like the Unabomber story. Did you watch that on Netflix? The story of the Unabomber?
I haven't seen it yet. Is it good?
It was really good, yeah. Yeah, it was really, because it went from like the linguistic approach to catching a killer, and it was like a new thing the FBI had used. I don't know how much truth is in there, because it's quite difficult. It's like like The Crown, the TV series, The Crown. It's like we obviously don't know the dialogues of what people of what these people said. So they're created, they're invented, but they're based on many interviews, reports, and you can kind of guess the sort of language somebody would use by if you research them enough in the media and from what their friends say about them. Has any of your books ever been talked about to making a movie or a TV series or something?
Not so far. I mean, the first one about the death penalty, that's kind of tough. The Hatred at Home, there's a lot of I think there's actually a lot of movie potential in there. Part of the problem is trying to get a hold of those guys. I mean, most of them are actually close to being out of prison, but two of them are going to be deported, and then the other one, I don't know what he's going to end up doing. If he's just going to come back here to Columbus or what.
I mean, would you write the script for that? Would you want to take hold of the script, or would you hand it over to somebody else?
I don't know. Script writing to me is that's a whole other skill set. I mean, I'm always willing to learn something new, but I've never tackled that.
I had a question. Talking of obviously being an ex-criminal lawyer and thinking a lot about miscarriages of justice, and it's something even I've had the opportunity to teach law. Andrew, do you think when you look at the way, because obviously we don't have the death penalty here, but looking at the way that the way that when you investigate miscarriages of justice and the death penalty and this kind of idea of like here we do have appeal, layers of appeal and a final kind of option of we even have our own version of the Supreme Court. Does it become more and more apparent to you that the idea of having death, whether it's lethal injection or whatever methods that people use in America around the world, does the idea of that become even more that it's not it can't be really validated as a way to treat people in this day and age? Or do you feel like the Americans are still quite in favor of having this for the most severe of crimes, even if afterwards it turns out it was a wrongful conviction or whatever? What are your thoughts?
Well, good question. Virginia just became the first southern U.S. state to get rid of the death penalty, which I don't think anyone would have predicted. Ohio, where I am, we're pretty much on a moratorium because it's no longer possible to get the lethal drugs, and there's no huge appetite among the legislature here to switch back to the electric chair. So my sense is what's happening is that, and let me also say, there's been a huge awareness in recent years of the issue of people who are innocent going to death row. There's been a number of exonerations. I mean, several in Ohio, but actually other states, Illinois dumped their entire death penalty because there were so many people who either were just flat out innocent or their trials were just so ridiculously biased. We've had state after state recently abolish the death penalty. I can't remember how many states we're down to, but it's only like maybe 22 states left, and of those, there's really only a handful that actually carry out executions. And in Ohio, actually, I just did a story on this. There's actually a growing number of Republicans who are joining the voices of Democrats who want to get rid of the death penalty, and the Republicans usually, they have a kind of a three-part argument, at least in Ohio, but I think nationally as well. A number of them are what they call 100% pro-life, so they're opposed to abortion, but they do carry that all the way through the death penalty. They're opposed to taking, they're opposed to the taking of life. They're also concerned about the cost. It costs a lot to have a death penalty, not to execute someone. That's actually not that expensive. But what I'm talking about is the appeals that you need to make sure that it's done fairly. Those last for decades, and the amount of money that states pay for those appeals, you could spend that money on so many other things. And then they do raise the specter that there have been people who have been exonerated and didn't belong in death row. And if you just take Ohio as an example, we have Republicans starting to join Democrats calling for an end to the death penalty. There's no executions that are going to happen for any number of years because we can't get the drugs anymore. I think society is evolving as people look at this issue and decide whether it's really the thing they want to do. And honestly, if you look at any poll in the United States, most people, if they're asked, do you support the death penalty? Again, depending on the state you're in, a slight majority are probably still going to say yes. But the second question is, would you support life in prison with absolutely no chance of parole instead of the death penalty? The majority of people are then going to say yes. Oh, yes, I would choose that. So that's kind of a long answer, but that's all the way of saying that I think you're seeing this evolution to there's fewer and fewer death sentences. There's fewer and fewer executions. I can't predict when the death penalty might go away in the United States, but I would never have called Virginia getting rid of it. So things are slowly happening. Ohio will be an interesting case study.
Ohio's the second most death penalties, no?
We were. When I was writing that book, we were. Was that book No Winners Here Tonight? Yeah.
Yeah. This book, yeah, and so all these things are documented in this book.
That's right. Yeah.
So how much? So I think it's changed a lot since then, because that was like 10 years ago.
Yeah. No, things have. I mean, I really should write another book on it because. Yeah. Like I said, when I wrote that book, Ohio had an active death chamber. 1 year we executed 7 people. Yeah. I mean, there hasn't been an execution in Ohio since 2018, and like I said, I don't anticipate one for. I mean, I don't even know when. It may be never. So I mean, they've changed remarkably.
Seems like things are shifting in the right direction from what you've said, and. I was just, while you were talking, Andrew, I was remembering this huge case we had. One of the biggest miscarriages of justice. When I was growing up, Tim might remember. It was in the 80s. The Birmingham 6 is accused of being involved in Irish IRA bombing. And, you know, it took so many, I think, decades and appeals before they were exonerated. But I was thinking, my God, if we had the American system, if we had the death penalty, these guys would never have seen, you know, over the decades, you know, their freedom ever happening. So I guess for me, I'm an optimist, and I hope, like you said, if we're evolving in the direction of, you know, getting rid of things like this, unless, you know, there's no. I think there's always another option, but yeah, like you said, if people consider even life imprisonment without parole, I think anything is a better option.
Where do you stand on that, Andrew? Do you like prison? Is it more? Do you lean towards more like rehabilitation or just as a punishment?
I mean, I don't really have a strict opinion on this. What I would say is that we've seen a really interesting phenomenon in the States during the pandemic. The prison populations have gone way down because there have been big efforts to keep people out of prison, because what better place to catch COVID than prison? Mm-hmm. So in Ohio, for example, when the pandemic started, there were probably 49,000 people in Ohio's prisons, which is just unbelievable. And now it's down to 43,000 and falling. Mm-hmm. And there's a big effort and there's a lot of interest, both by sort of people who you would consider like pro law enforcement. Mm-hmm. And there are people who would be much more interested in rehabilitation. They both have kind of the same goal. Let's try to keep that prison population low, because society is probably better off. And frankly, it's so much less expensive.
Yeah. You know, when you, as an author, obviously as a fiction writer, I mean, do you factor in audiences? Because obviously one thing, you know, when I'm reading it is, you know, there's a lot of things which maybe American people, you know, obviously the whole idea of Andy, you know, is an American footballer, and there's all that link to things that maybe only Americans get. Obviously things have moved over to Europe and the rest of the world, you know, coffee and donuts and Starbucks and all that. But I guess the question is like, I mean, do you kind of see yourself, right, well, I'm going to write and I'm going to just, you know, use my experiences living in America. So it might primarily just appeal to an American audience, or like, for example, I grew up reading, you know, maybe, you know, a lot of John Grisham, and there was a lot of still crossover, and you could get it even though you didn't live in the US. So do you kind of think about your audience, who you might appeal to, or do you just write whatever you feel might work for your style of writing?
Yeah, good question. You know, it's probably a combination. People are always asking me if these are sports books, and I try to say, you know, the short answer is no. I'm actually not that big a fan of American football. It's not like I watched all the time or pay attention to it. What I was fascinated about with Andy's character is, I mean, where I live, American football in Ohio and Columbus is a huge deal. And I was fascinated by the idea of what would happen if you took somebody who was at the top of that, who was like the star and everybody revered him, and then he just blew it and became this persona non grata, almost, you know, fell through hubris, back to those my Greek and Latin days. That, to me, that's what fascinates me about looking at this. And, you know, so I guess the short answer is I try to write these so that they're hopefully a little bit universal, and that the themes people are dealing with and that are in the books that anybody could relate to. You know, I don't write these to like target them to an American sports audience. Frankly, I don't know what it's like in England. Most of my readers are women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, you know, which I love. I mean, those are the people who read mysteries, and those are the people who come to my readings and my events, and I love having them. So, and none of them I know very much about sports. So, you know, hopefully that's a sign that I'm writing for a sort of general audience.
I think that's the thing all over in England too. Mostly it's women who read. You know, I've very few friends who say they read. I know Amit reads, and you know, I read a bit, but it's like generally, that's why I think there needs to be a different approach to selling books and marketing books, and maybe to influence younger guys to read. You know.
Yeah, it's a tough call. I don't know what to do about it, but we try.
Yeah. I mean, how do you go about, like, so you do lots of self-promotion, self-marketing, or just you Swallow Press you're with, yeah? Do they do lots for you, or is it mostly down to you?
It's a combination. You can't be a writer anymore without doing a lot of promotion yourself. I mean, unless you're Stephen King or John Grisham,
Yeah.
or maybe Ian Rankin. I mean, those people have a team, but other than that, I mean, I send out emails promoting my stuff. I get on social media. I set up a lot of my own events. And by the way, I'm happy to do that. I'm overjoyed when I reach out and somebody wants to have me. But the days of just writing your book, handing it to your publisher, and then starting back on your next book without doing anything, I mean, that's over.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. It's just work. It's just part of what you do. If you're a writer now, you write, but you also market. It's just part of the process.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Hope to catch up again, yeah, and then maybe with another writer on the channel, because this is what I tell everybody every week. We're trying to introduce different people. So we've had like a lecturer from Harvard on, you know, talking about her work. We had a comedian from Scotland who's, you know, done quite well. So we have different types of writers on, and some in the pipeline, and try and connect them all in some kind of weird way, you know. So maybe you see the channel in the future, you say, I want to be on with him, or make a connection with him or her. That's the idea, really.
Sounds great.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really good talking to you. Great questions. Good meeting you both. And yeah, let's stay in touch.
Take care.
Appreciate your time. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Sure.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.